invite you to take your Bibles once more and turn to the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew chapter 23. This morning we'll consider verses 1 through 12. I remind you again, this is God's Word. Let's give our attention to its reading. Then Jesus said to the crowds and to his disciples, "The scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. So do and observe whatever they tell you, but not the works they do. For they preach, but do not practice. They tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders. But they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. And they do all their deeds to be seen by others. For they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. And they love the place of honor at feasts, and the best seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and being called rabbi by others. But you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. The greatest among you shall be your servant. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be exalted." The grass withers, and the flower fades, but the word of our God will stand forever. Beloved congregation of the Lord Jesus Christ, we continue our study of Matthew's Gospel this morning and the last week of Jesus' earthly life. He is moving toward the cross. It is true, as Calvin points out in the Institutes when we talked about this morning in Sunday school, his whole life was a perpetual cross. But it comes now to the time of the crucifixion. That time when he'll be rejected. Not rejected by this Pharisee or that, not rejected by some people, but by all people. His disciples abandoning him. And we're coming close to that time. And as we've noted in our studies these past weeks, that the Pharisees, the scribes, they're trying to find a reason to destroy Jesus. They're trying to find a reason to bring him up on charges. But they failed thus far. We looked last week at 3 specific attempts. The attempt by the disciples of the Pharisees with the Herodians, and the question about whether or not it's lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. And then came the Sadducees with their question about marriage and the resurrection, and this hypothetical situation where 7 men were married to 1 woman. Whose would she be in the resurrection? And the scribes came, asking Jesus which law was the greatest. And each time they were seeking to trap Jesus, but we saw that they were unsuccessful. He answered every one of their questions, and didn't just answer them, but then he would go on to challenge them and to show them where they were misunderstanding the law or the word of God. And finally, he asked them a question about the Christ. We were confronted with those words last week. Those words by Jesus reminding us that he is the very Son of God. He is very God and very man. It is before him that we bow, and it is before him that the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the scribes, and even the Herodians should have bowed. You see, they were seeking to trap him, but here is a man who has the very words of life. Why would they not bow down before him? They wouldn't, because they simply desire to reject him. They simply desire to keep finding a way to condemn him, to crucify the Lord of glory. In our chapter this morning that we begin, and we're going to continue it over the next weeks, it contains the last words that Jesus speaks in the temple. They are significant words. For his final words are condemnation, ultimately, of the Pharisees, of the scribes. You see, in the previous chapters that we've looked at, There have been debates about the parables. And Jesus has exposed the failings of the Pharisees. But here in this chapter, there is a direct attack. A number of commentators point out how harsh Jesus' words are here in this chapter. We'll see even next week. We might want to pause and say, Jesus, there must be a nicer way to say this. You catch more bees with honey than with vinegar. Whatever that's supposed to mean. But Jesus is very God and very man. And he comes to save his people. And the Pharisees are standing in the way. They're standing in the way. So he will rebuke them soundly. You see, they were supposed to be those who were leaders, who would care for God's people. All the way back in the Old Testament, God establishes leaders. He calls Moses. They set up elders all throughout the Old Testament, whether it's kings, prophets, priests. God cared for his people, those who were the sheep of his pasture, he calls them. And so he appointed overseers, he appointed shepherds to care for them. But Ezekiel 34 reminds us of the failings of the shepherds. For rather than feeding the sheep, they began to feed on the sheep. And that's what Jesus is picking up on here, is the Old Testament condemnation against those false teachers. And there's nothing nice when it comes to driving wolves away from the sheep. He comes with words that are harsh because he comes to protect. He comes to save his sheep. And so this chapter, we're going to find out both this week and next week, by God's grace, is one of heavy judgment. Here are these words in Matthew 23 before us this morning. Jesus exposes the Pharisees as hypocrites. But even there, he warns. He warns us. You see, he warns the people, the crowds that gather together. In fact, let's begin our study looking there at the Pharisees' office. He says to the crowds and to the disciples, he wants them all to hear this. The crowds are those innumerable, that large number of people that follow Jesus everywhere. His disciples, those 12 that were selected by him, he wants to warn them all. He tells them, the scribes and the Pharisees sit on Moses' seat. This tells us something about their authority. As I said, from the very beginning in the Old Testament, God establishes people who would lead, who would care for, who would protect his flock, his people. The scribes and the Pharisees were to be among those. They sit on Moses' seat. This seat, it refers to an actual chair that was in the synagogues. And it stood for kind of a symbol for the teaching authority of Moses' successors, as those who would interpret the law of God, who would apply it to God's people. We read of this call of God's people to be leaders and to teach them in both Deuteronomy, but also after the exile in Nehemiah. In fact, in Nehemiah, they built this huge platform and they erected a pulpit, and the law of God was read. And then there were people who stood by and they gave the sense or the meaning of the law to the people so they could understand what was being read. And the point being that God has established those who would teach within his congregations. And so here, this Moses seat is not meant to be thought of as something made up. It's something that actually means something, and it speaks to the authority of the Pharisees. And Jesus even goes on to say, practice and observe whatever they tell you. Now, we don't want to push back there, right? We know the Pharisees are bad news. We know the Pharisees, again, as I said before, if there was a movie with the Pharisees, they'd enter in and the ominous music would begin to play because we know that those are the bad guys. But they didn't necessarily know that in Jesus' day. They were those who appeared holy. They were those who were set up to teach the people. And they'd even set themselves up. And so we might be tempted to think that such leadership among God's people is to be rejected. But Jesus doesn't go in that direction. No, he says, observe whatever they tell you. Now again, yes, he must mean there that if they tell you to do something against the law of God, you don't do that. But insofar as they sit on Moses' seat and they tell you what to do according to the law of God, you are to do that. It says not what they do, for they preach, but they do not practice. They preach, but they do not practice. God establishes leaders among his people. There must be teachers who will give instruction, even in the new covenant, while we wait for Jesus to return. So we see here the validity of such an office, the importance of such a task, and yet the danger that is there for those who preach but do not practice. This is one of the reasons why later Paul will tell Timothy to watch his doctrine and his life. His doctrine and his life. When the Apostle Paul speaks about elders and deacons being appointed within churches, he will emphasize the teaching role of the elder, but he will talk also about the elder's life, his hospitality, his love for the people, his humility. We should not think that Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees here gets rid of those offices within the church. We also must recognize the danger that's involved for those who practice or who preach but do not practice. They are, in fact, condemned here by Christ. Perhaps we can say the solution. I think we find the solution later in Scripture. I think this is the right way to think about this, because it's often the case throughout church history that there will be those among the officers in the church that are unholy, and so the tendency is to sort of either go one of two directions. You either have to approve everything they do because they're officers, which isn't right. You shouldn't do that. And the other tendency is to reject all offices within the church, a kind of populism within the church, and that's not right either. I think we find the best way to approach it in Acts chapter 17, when the Apostle Paul travels to Berea and he proclaims the word to them. And it says that they received the word with all eagerness, examining the Scriptures daily to see if these things were so. See, there's a responsibility to those who hear as well as to those who proclaim. And that's what Jesus, I think, is getting at here. Is that one must be able and ready and willing to examine these things. And so we see first the Pharisees' authority, the Pharisees' office. But what it was their practice. What is it that Jesus is condemning? He begins by pointing out that they tie up heavy burdens, hard to bear, and lay them on people's shoulders, but they themselves are not willing to move them with their finger. There's a twofold condemnation here, and we want to understand both of these things. The first is that they tie up heavy burdens. This likely is a description of the kind of extra-biblical traditions of the rabbis. That was a pillar of Pharisaic teaching in Judaism. We must remember the way the Pharisees were viewed, as I've already said, not just as religious leaders, but as the pious ones. They were those who took the law of God seriously. So seriously, in fact, that they built a fence around it. Not only was it wrong to labor on the Sabbath, but they went on to define what labor was. And you've heard me talk about this before. It came down to the number of steps somebody took. And as long as they took under that many steps, they were okay. It didn't necessarily matter where their feet took them, but as long as they went under those number of steps. When they condemned Jesus and his disciples because they're rolling grain in their fingers, they said they were threshing, they were farming, rather than simply just eating. Or, perhaps the silliest, I suppose, if those aren't silly enough, the one that, the law that said that if you spit on the Lord's Day or on the Sabbath, and it rolled in the dirt, that was considered farming and was therefore to be condemned. You see, they would build a fence around each of these commandments. But here's the real trick, and this is what Jesus is exposing them for, is because they use those burdens in order to break the law themselves. You see, they were masters of words. And so they would say things like, "Oh, mother and father, I would help you, but what I would give to you, I've already dedicated to God." Even though they might have just dedicated it 30 seconds before because they were afraid their mother or father might need something. He said they built fences in order to avoid the law of God, but they wouldn't let anybody else avoid the law of God. As one commentator put it, they multiplied the number of ways in which man may offend God, but they failed in helping him to please God. And what's more, they don't help the people who bear those burdens. Some argue the Pharisees' error was simply in not helping others, that even the Pharisees had gotten the whole law right. They neglected love, compassion, and mercy. They neglected to help those who struggle. It's a twofold error. Tied up heavy burdens, and they wouldn't even lift a finger to help them. Think about it. And these are the people that were appointed by God, that is set apart to oversee and to care for God's people. But rather than caring for them, they just laid burden after burden after burden, and they didn't do anything to help. You can imagine the kind of soul-crushing ministry the Pharisees would have had. And it's easy, of course, to point back to the Pharisees, but we all know that there are, in fact, Pharisees in our own day who approach God's word this way, who lay burden after burden after burden on others, but offer no help, offer no hope. Contrast that with Jesus. "Come to me, all who are weary, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." The Pharisees had heavy burdens. The Pharisees didn't care. But here Jesus comes in order to take those burdens upon himself. He yoke himself to his people so that they can be cared for. Well, he presses on. He presses on. Not only are these heavy burdens that they won't help with in any way, but they also have this very showy piety. Verse 5, they do all their deeds to be seen by others, for they make their phylacteries broad and their fringes long. And if that last sentence is odd to you, it's supposed to be. It's not something we normally think about, phylacteries and fringes. But let's think first, they do what they do to be seen by others. Now, Jesus has already condemned this in Matthew chapter 6 when he tells his disciples to beware of practicing your righteousness before other people in order to be seen by them. And he goes on to talk about the way that people give, the way that they offer their prayers, the way that they fast. And he points at the Pharisees. When they gave, they would sound the trumpet. They would let everybody know what they were giving, exactly what it cost them. When they prayed, they would stand in the street and raise their hands and say, "Oh Lord, I thank you that I am not like the tax collector." When they fasted, they made themselves look emaciated, weak. They wanted everybody to know their holiness. They wanted people to say, "Oh, you look so holy. I wish I could be as holy as you." And Jesus says that you've received your reward in full. If that's what you want, if what you want is people to notice you, then that's what you get. And if that's what you get, that's all that you get. You get what you want. The Pharisees love the praise of men, and if we're honest, so do we. We must avoid the trap. What does he mean about these broad phylacteries and these long fringes? If you go back to the Old Testament, you find out about the idea that with regard to the phylacteries, that the people of God, they were to write the law down, and they were to bind them, and they were to bind the law as frontlets between their eyes and around their wrist. And over time, this became a tradition where you would wear this little leather box around your wrist, or sometimes you would have it hanging between your eyes. And on it, inside of it, it's like those little grains of rice that they go and they write your name on. It had the Torah written in really small letters, and they would roll it up and they would put it inside of this phylactery, and then you would wear it around your wrist or on between your eyes. And over time, apparently, the Pharisees, their phylacteries got broader and broader and broader. You see, they drew attention to themselves because they had the law before them. And look at how great they think of the law. Or the fringes. Again, if you want to know about phylacteries, it's Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 to 8. Numbers 15 talks about the fringes. Verses 37 to 40, the Lord said to Moses, "Speak to the people of Israel and tell them to make tassels on the corners of their garments throughout their generations, and to put a cord of blue on the tassel of each corner. And it shall be a tassel for you to look at and remember all the commandments of the Lord, to do them, not to follow after your own heart and your own eyes, which you are inclined to whore after. So you shall remember and do all my commandments and be holy to your God." Now, the first thing I want to note about these phylacteries and these fringes is that God gives tangible, visible things to remind his people of who they are. And so, we know this. We know this in the New Covenant. We have baptism. We have the Lord's Supper. These are visible, tangible things that remind us of who we are as God's people, set apart from this world, and who God is as a God who loves us, as Christ who gave himself up for us. But imagine if we started to make that communion cup just bigger and bigger and bigger, just so that it looked really, really pretty. Just so that I could have the biggest gulp of the most wine I could possibly get. Or perhaps we encrusted our baptismal with jewels. You see, this is what they were doing. They were making it glorious and sort of beautifying it for the sake of beautifying it. And so their fringes were long, and I honestly tried to figure out exactly what that means. I don't know if that meant that they started down low and they carried on like a bride's dress, or if they were literally walking around with their really long fringes. Whatever the case, they were drawing attention to themselves. You see, God gave these things as ways to remind his people of how they were set apart and what they were called to do, how they were called to live. But they turned them around and they used them as ways to show how holy they were. You see, they desired public honor. They loved the place of honor at feasts and the best seats in the synagogues and greetings in the marketplaces and being called rabbi by others. Whether it was the seat, the formal greeting, or the title, they wanted as much as they could get of it. And this continues. As one commentator points out, whether we think of high church ceremonialism or low church showmanship, both of these distract from true worship by calling unnecessary attention to the human worship leaders. You see, those who lead among God's people are to be humble. Those who lead among God's people are to exalt Christ and not themselves. And here the Pharisees have rejected Christ, but they've done so by exalting themselves. The reason why they couldn't see the Christ that was before them is because they had already turned away from God in their hearts. Outwardly, they looked holy. Outwardly, they looked showy. But as we find out next week, inwardly, they were like a rotten grave. They were dead. And so Jesus goes on because he's instructing his disciples. He's warning them against the Pharisees, but he's not yet fully condemning the Pharisees. That's coming. He's warning his disciples, and one of the things he wants to warn them about is that they themselves might be tempted to this. See, it's very natural to want everybody to look up to us. It's very natural to want to look really good in front of people, to look holy, to be applauded. That's a normal desire. It's natural. It's often sinful, but it's natural. So Jesus tells us the cure for hypocrisy. Because you see, that's what the problem was with the Pharisees. You see, they were only outwardly these things. Inwardly, they were corrupt. Inwardly, they turned away from God. They only played the part of being holy, and that's what it means to be a hypocrite. Don't let anybody ever tell you, oh, the church is just full of a bunch of hypocrites. They say that they say they want to live good, but they just mess up all the time. That's not the definition of a hypocrite. A hypocrite is a person who only plays the part, who wears a mask in order to be showy, in order to impress people. That's what a hypocrite is. A hypocrite is not a sinner who is saved by grace, who is struggling and trying to serve and love God, but failing in various ways. That is not what a hypocrite is. A hypocrite is somebody who only plays the part. And so the resolution, the cure for hypocrisy that we see here is humility. He says, but you are not to be called rabbi, for you have one teacher, and you are all brothers. And call no man your father on earth, for you have one Father who is in heaven. Neither be called instructors, for you have one instructor, the Christ. Now, by the way, you want to be careful here. There's a certain way that we approach these verses. If we do that, we actually evidence a far more Pharisaical mentality. You see, if we walk to these verses and we say, okay, rabbi, father, instructor, all right, don't call anybody those things. But then we create all these other sort of titles. In fact, I've been in churches where the idea of brother, capital B, is a title. And if you don't call somebody brother, then you've disrespected them. And that actually is evidencing far more a Pharisaical approach to titles than what Jesus is talking about here. You see, there's nothing mysterious or mystical. There's nothing magical about these words that Jesus is saying, as long as you avoid these words, you're okay. That's not it at all. He's saying, don't give to people what belongs to God alone. Don't give to people what belongs to God alone. You see, they loved and demanded titles. And the point is that we are not to render to man what is due to God alone. This is what Matthew Henry says. He says, for him that is taught in the word, to give respect to him that teaches, is commendable enough in him that gives it. But for him that teaches, to love it, to demand it, and to affect it, to be puffed up with it, and to be displeased if it be omitted, is sinful and abominable. We are not to render to man what is due to God alone. Jesus says it this way in Matthew 20. He says, you know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. It shall not be so among you. But whoever would be great among you must be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be your slave, even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. You see, he rebukes the pride that is natural to us as sinners. We are together to worship our triune God, for he is our Father. Christ is our instructor. He is the chief shepherd of the sheep, as we read in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. And so first we note the equality that is called for here among disciples. He says, you are all brothers. We're to see ourselves as belonging to the same family, not lording it over one another, not lording position over one another. May it never be the case that our officers, that our elders, that our deacons, that any pastor who proclaims the word lords it over the congregation. That is a Pharisee attitude. Jesus says it must not be. We're to serve one another. We're to love one another. We're to care for one another. He even says, the greatest among you shall be your servant. John Calvin comments, he says, he therefore declares that the highest honor in the church is not government, but service. Whoever keeps himself within this limit, whatever may be the title which he bears, takes nothing away either from God or from Christ. As on the other hand, it serves no good purpose to take the name of servant for the purpose of cloaking that power which diminishes the authority of Christ as a master. And Calvin's making the point that I try to make. He makes it so much more eloquently. It's not about the words you use. You can call yourself a servant, but in your mind, it's a capital S servant, and everybody else had better bow down and notice how servanty you are. That's a Pharisee attitude. No, Jesus is actually saying that if you want to lead among the people of God, serve. And the language, again, of the shepherd and the sheep, it's such beautiful language because of how not glorious and glamorous it is. Because shepherds clean up after sheep. Shepherds get bitten by sheep. Shepherds spend long nights in the cold caring for sheep. He serves. And Jesus is the chief shepherd of the sheep. You see, he's the one who came from heaven to earth. He humbled himself. He washes the feet of the disciples. He gives himself for our sake. How can we see ourselves as anything other than servants among one another? As Jesus says in Luke 17, you also, when you have done all that you are commanded, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what was our duty. See, beloved, this is a call to us all. And especially to those who are set apart to care for the church of God. The elder, the deacons, pastors. If you aspire to such office, know that it is not a position to lord it over others, but the call to be a servant of God's people. And not a servant with a wink and a nod that means you know that you're higher, but a true servant. And there are good results when we realize and live this way among one another. See, we don't judge one another for weakness. We seek to help those who are weak among us. We don't become like the Pharisees who see the heavy burdens and sit back and say, well, that's an awfully heavy burden you have to bear. But rather, we become those who help bear one another's burdens. This is the result when we move from a position of humility instead of pride. And that, of course, is where Jesus ends. Whoever exalts himself will be humbled. And whoever humbles himself will be exalted. It is an attitude of lowliness that Jesus calls for here, grounded in the recognition of one's status before God. As the Apostle Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, not many of you were wise according to worldly standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, even things that are not, to bring to nothing the things that are, so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. I'm speaking of the Apostle Paul. You see, it's when he's humbled that it's in his humility, it's through humbling that God draws him to himself. We are to seek humility because we are sinners who have been saved by a gracious God. And the more you understand your sinfulness, the more you bow before the majesty and mercy of God. Thomas Watson says, a gracious soul labors to make the worst of his sins, but hypocrites make the best of them. They do not deny that they are sinners, but they do what they can to lessen their sins. They indeed offend sometimes, but it is just their nature, and it has been such a long time, they say. These are excuses rather than confessions. But Jesus calls us to avoid hypocrisy, because hypocrisy, as we're going to see, will be condemned. To avoid hypocrisy. And the only way you avoid hypocrisy, beloved, is by humbling yourself before God. And the only way you humble yourself before God is by seeing who you really are apart from Christ. Your great need because of your sin. And not just a little bit of sin. It's not as though God just needed to help you a little bit further and then you'd be saved. But you were dead in the trespasses and sins in which you once walked. You were by nature children of wrath like the rest of mankind. But God is rich in mercy because of the great love with which He loved us. He redeems us. You see, this is the great truth, and this is the cure for hypocrisy. The cure for hypocrisy is not trying even harder to make yourself look better, but rather humble yourself before God.